Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of News Dose, where I give you all of the latest gaming news. And it looks like we're going to start this week off with some Xbox Series X gameplay. Yes, we finally got to see some Xbox Series X gameplay, some of which is pretty impressive, and I'll explain why. More excitingly though, a big sequel is being planned by an Xbox studio, and this one is surely going to have fans very happy. With that said, not everything is great in the gaming world, especially if you like Japanese games, and we have a very weird PlayStation 5 story to talk about that may affect the launch of the PlayStation 5. So don't go anywhere and we will talk about all that. But first, let's go over some of the quick news, starting off with Ori. Now, one of my favorite games from this generation has been Ori. Both Ori and the Blind Forest and Will of the Wisps really stands out to me as being some of the best Metroidvania games of all time. They excel when it comes to platforming, and I think the sequel did a really good job with the combat as well, but the way the sequel ended, it almost seemed as if this franchise was ending for good. Well, that may not actually be the case, as Moon Studios says they've left the door open for a return of Ori's world. They did say that they have nothing planned for the moment, and they're focused on their new games, so don't get too excited for another Ori game just yet. However, they could end up going back to Ori's world in the future with a prequel or even a spin-off. Now that would be really interesting. The world of Ori is both magical and fascinating, so I would be curious to see how they could incorporate this world without Ori. I mean, if it's a spin-off or prequel, I would assume that Ori wouldn't be directly the main focus, so I'm not sure how different the gameplay would be, but I think Moon Studios is insanely talented. I know some Xbox fans often talk about how Microsoft should acquire them because they're so good at what they do. I know this much though, whatever they make, I'm certainly paying attention, whether that be Ori or something completely different. And again, their next game will be a new IP, so I'm pretty optimistic for whatever that game is. I will ask you though, would you like to see a spin-off or prequel to Ori in the future? Let me know in the comments below. In other news, you remember that big multiplayer Amazon game Crucible? It actually released earlier this year, but it wasn't very successful, and it struggled to find a user base so much that they eventually unreleased the game and put it back into beta to focus on bringing that game back better than ever before. Well, sadly, this game will no longer be making a comeback, and it's officially been cancelled, which is an incredibly bad look for Amazon. I will start off by saying, I feel very bad for the developers here because they spent a lot of time developing this game, and to see it fail this way is just a lot of hard work wasted. I do feel bad for the developers, but this is also a big deal for Amazon. Amazon is trying to get into the gaming space by not only releasing their cloud-based streaming service Luna, but they're also trying to develop their own games. Well, this was not a good start, and it makes you wonder if Amazon really knows what they're doing in the game space. I think for a lot of hardcore gamers, Amazon and Google trying to enter the game market has caused some apprehension. These are huge companies and they pose the threat of acquiring studios, but when you see games fail like this, it certainly hurts building that trust with fans. So we're already seeing that with Google Stadia and its rocky launch, but now Amazon seems to be stumbling with their own big games. It definitely makes you wonder if they're up to the task of making big games like this, but sadly Crucible will no longer be a thing. Unfortunately, that's not the only bad news we have to talk about though, because Level 5 may not be releasing any more games outside of Japan. Yeah, so I saw this morning, and immediately I had myself hoping this wasn't true, but it's being reported by GameIndustry.biz that Level 5 is virtually halting operations in North America, and one of their sources are saying they have no concrete plans for further games to be released outside of Japan. That is a pretty big blow for fans of Japanese games, and while Level 5 may not be as beloved as companies like Sega, Capcom, and Square Enix, they do have a pretty good catalog of games. I really like the Ni no Kuni franchise myself, and I think that they're some of the better modern JRPGs, so those will be sorely missed if this does turn out to be true. They also have games like Professor Layton, Yokai Watch, Dark Cloud, and White Knight Chronicles, so they have made some pretty good franchises in the past. And I just hate hearing this. I've been seeing a lot of people kind of hope somebody acquires them and takes better care of these IP, and honestly, that might be the best outcome for fans of these franchises. I think Nintendo in specific could do really well for some of these franchises, but I really don't want to see another Konami situation here. Konami has some very beloved franchises, but since they don't focus on console development as much anymore, some of their big franchises have just kind of vanished, and that's too bad really. I don't want to see the same thing happen with Ni no Kuni and Professor Layton, but that is the current situation for Level 5. Let's move on to something a little bit more positive though, because Xbox may have plans for a big RPG to return with the Xbox Series X in mind. Yes, so according to the well-respected insider Daniel Mod, Obsidian Entertainment is planning to make a sequel to one of this generation's best RPGs, The Outer Worlds. Now this would be huge because The Outer Worlds was a breakout hit among RPG fans, and this kind of goes along with the narrative that Xbox is really going to be the place to be for RPGs next generation. You have to keep in mind, even though The Outer Worlds was multi-platform, Microsoft now owns Obsidian Entertainment, so the sequel more than likely will be an Xbox and PC exclusive. So if you're keeping track here, Microsoft already has 7 AAA RPGs in development. You have Fable, The Elder Scrolls, Starfield, inXile's big unannounced RPG, Arcane is working on a first-person shooter RPG, and then Obsidian is working on Avowed, and they're planning a sequel to The Outer Worlds. Yeah, they are going big with these RPGs, and I think a sequel to The Outer Worlds could be a real system seller. I mean, if you think about it, The Outer Worlds does not just draw attention to Xbox fans. Because it was a multi-platform game before, it also has fans on other platforms, and in order to play the sequel, they're either going to have to invest in an Xbox or play it on PC, both of which will be viable, but that could be a big deal for Xbox going forward. And that really goes to any of these franchises that was previously multi-platform. Either way, I'm excited for a sequel of The Outer Worlds. That was a very good RPG that was almost like a mix of Mass Effect with Fallout, and I think with a bigger budget from Microsoft, they can really make a special game with a sequel. Now that wasn't the only Xbox news today though, because we got some gameplay for the Xbox Series X. Several media outlets got to test out both Dirt 5 and Yakuza Like a Dragon. Now Yakuza 7 isn't necessarily going to be the most visually impressive game in the world. This is more of a AA game, and it actually released on the PlayStation 4 in Japan earlier this year, so visually this is probably not going to be a huge generational leap, but it will be 60 frames per second, and that's great to hear. Early impressions also paint it as being very fun with its turn-based combat, and it's a little wacky as usual, and has an engaging story. I keep saying this, but this is going to be a game you really need to pay attention to with the Series X launch. I can certainly tell you that the Yakuza franchise is fantastic for gamers wanting a story-driven experience, and according to the developers, you can jump into Like a Dragon even if it's not your first in the franchise. As for Dirt 5, this is where we can get a little bit more technical, as they're trying to do a little bit more here to show off some of that next generation power with the Xbox Series X. You do have to keep in mind this is an early generation game, so it's not going to be perfect, and this is an early build of Dirt 5, so things will be even better by the time of full release. But Digital Foundry pointed out some very impressive features with Dirt 5. In fact, it has 3 different game modes. You have image quality, frame rate, and 120 Hz. Now the image quality and frame rate both do a relatively good job at staying close to 4K resolution and 60 frames per second. It does dip down to around 1800p at the beginning of the race, as well as when too many cars are on the same screen. But other than that, they're usually 4K 60 frames per second. The main difference between these two modes is that the image quality has better shadows. FPS does drop a little more often in image quality mode, but nothing that should be that noticeable. So overall, both modes are rather impressive in terms of their resolution and frame rate. The most impressive mode though is 120 Hz, where you can play Dirt 5 at 120 frames per second. Obviously you do have to sacrifice visuals here, but that mythical 120 frames per second is possible, and more impressively, it pretty much runs at a steady 120 frames per second, with only slight dips of a couple frames on some occasions. That is pretty cool to hear, especially if you have a TV capable of running 120 Hz. I know when these next generation consoles first got announced, a lot of people scoffed at the idea that we would see games run at 120 frames per second, but we're already seeing a few at the launch of the Xbox Series X. Both Dirt 5 and the Falconeer will be fully capable of running 120 frames per second, and that goes to show you just how much better these consoles are compared to the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. I know these visuals don't exactly scream next generation per se, but you have to remember that a lot of the games this generation was barely capable of running 30 frames per second, let alone 120. So that's pretty cool to hear, and as I said earlier, as time goes on, we're only going to see better and better looking games as the generation progresses, with the Series X and the PlayStation 5. Early generation games are rarely the best looking games, but we're at least seeing some of the capabilities with games raising that frame rate to 60 and even 120. On to our last topic though, and this is a very weird story. But Sony's having some issues with the PlayStation 5 over in India, and this could end up causing a delay over in that region, unfortunately. So what's happening here is that the PlayStation 5 was trademarked in India in 2019, but not by Sony. Instead, it was apparently trademarked by the same guy who owns the trademark Cuckoos, which more or less makes counterfeit PlayStation 4 controllers. And to nobody's surprise, they're not necessarily the highest quality controllers. Well, now it sounds like he's going to try and cash in on the PlayStation 5 hype as well, though I'm not really entirely sure of what his intent is with this trademark. He may be planning to sell counterfeit PlayStation 5s, or maybe he's trying to get Sony to pay him for the trademark. Either way, this is pretty shady, and obviously Sony's going to go to court over this. It doesn't look like they stopped there though, because suddenly Amazon has been taking down all of the Cuckoos controllers, so it looks like Sony really isn't messing around here. They're trying to put an end to this counterfeit fiasco, and this guy may have messed with the wrong company here. He could have probably continued to sell his counterfeit controllers, but it looks like he took things just a little too far now, and Sony's had enough. Unfortunately though, this could cause a delay in India until this does get resolved. Hopefully not for too long, but we'll have to see what happens here. Anyways though, that's it for this episode, but if you liked the video, don't forget to hit the bell notification and subscribe button for more content just like this. Also, if you'd like to support the channel through Patreon, thank you for making this content possible. Peace out.